Greetings and welcome back to the Old Ways Rising Farm YouTube channel, where I'm currently wearing today's project, a new and improved version of the sailor's palm, or the palm thimble. Okay, this is a traditional tool used for sewing heavy canvas, especially, but also leather. And it's called a sailor's palm because the sail makers would use these as they're stitching the sails and doing rope work that involved needle passing any kind of twine through rope for all sorts of different purposes. This is the second version, and this is the second iteration of this tool. A few weeks ago, we made a first version, and this is the carcass of the first version that I took apart to serve as pattern for the second version. That first video, link at the top of the screen if you want to see it. But I used the first version successfully to make this whole pack. Okay, so it did work. But there were a couple of things in it that I sort of expected were going to be a problem, but I wanted to work with it and live with it for a little while just to see how it performed. The first was stretchiness of the leather, and it's going to be a little bit hard for the camera to pick this up, but the leather I used to make the first version was scraps from other projects that didn't need to be this rigid and stable. So it's a relatively thin, stretchy, shaved cowhide, split cowhide. So I kind of anticipated that was going to add up to a problem over time, and it did. It stretched enough that the hard palm, which in this case I'm using an antler tine, was just wiggling back and forth. So it wasn't always where I thought it was, and as I developed the muscle memory to put the needle in the right place every time I came in, the antler tine wasn't always where I thought it was. Right? So I ended up a number of times missing and kind of driving the needle into my palm, which is unfun. I said, gosh golly gee whizzikers, I wish I didn't just do that. So I sort of expected that to be a problem, but also what comes along with a stretchy, movie, hard item working against threads is it will always work through and start to wear out the thread, which also happened. You can kind of see one spot, the tip of the antler was sitting right here, and you can kind of see where it just sanded its way through the threads that are in there. So that was no good. The second problem was I just used the natural cut surface of this brow tine and was working against the marrow, which held up well enough to do a project, but it didn't hold up well enough to be a permanent, long-lasting tool. So the second thing we're doing is I've bored out all of that marrow, okay, in the middle of this piece, left the hard exterior, and then glued a cowbone little insert puck into the middle of it. Okay, so that puck goes. I used the thickest cowbone scrap that I had in my box of scraps, and it goes well down in, pretty much to the base of the marrow. The tips of these tines, especially in whitetail muley and moose antlers, where they narrow down, you pretty much don't have any marrow in there. Right? So I bored this all, not so much bored, but carved all of that marrow out until I got down to solid material, and then glued that puck all the way down in. Okay? There's a little tiny pocket of marrow in one specific spot. But this way, as I work with it, if I decide I want to reshape that surface for a better angle of attack or just a different angle of attack for different purposes, I have unlimited hard material that I can carve, work with, and don't have to worry about getting back down into soft stuff. So those are the two modifications. And then based on problems I found, and then just to make it stiffer, in this one, we wet form this little top piece of leather around a thick cowhide spacer so that the palm is even more rigid and locked in place. Okay, so I'll show you how to do that in this video as well. And then we stitch it with natural sinew. So these are some sinew threads, right? Real, literal, natural animal sinew. And this is a unique material that will do something no other stitching material will do, and that is shrink and pull things tight. This can be a detriment if you're sewing something soft like buckskin, because it also gets really, really hard, almost as hard as a metal wire, and can gradually, so if your threads don't stretch at all and you have a really stretchy material, the stretchy material is abrading itself against those threads and can eventually saw its way out. Which is why when I'm making clothing or something like that, I always try to use the material for the stitching, right? I want the same material. So when I'm sewing buckskin clothing, I use buckskin thonging. When I sewed this bag, this is cotton canvas, and I'm using flax sewing thread, so that the material and the thread have the same stretch. Well, here, where I'm doing something that is completely rigid, I want a completely rigid thread. And nothing is more rigid than natural sinew. You soak it, you sew with it. I always like to dip mine in a little bit of hide glue just so it sticks to itself a little bit better. Then you start and finish your ends just by a little wrap, and it'll just glue right in. And then as it hardens, it pulls things tighter and tighter and tighter and tighter together, so there's no wiggle. And that's really advantageous for this project. And no other thread could do that, including artificial sinew. Artificial sinew is just wax nylon. It's no different than nylon carpet thread, except in appearance. So you'll get a little tutorial on how to do this, and link at the top of the screen in a previous video where we've also done some work with natural sinew before on the channel. So I hope that you're interested in this. Come along for this iteration. And as you're watching this, I want you to think about the iterative process of design itself. When you're doing new things, don't expect your first version to be the version. Your first version you learn from, your second version you learn more, your third version pretty darn good, and after you've done 4 or 5 versions, you're really off to the races and you're making awesome world-class stuff. Okay? So embrace and learn to love that iterative process of design. So think about that as we're going through this video as well. The first step in rebuilding this thing is going to be to clean a few things up and take a few things apart. Okay? So we need to take this little spur clean off. Some of the threads have broken because it was wiggling too much, but we will deliberately take off the rest of those. So we have this by itself, can work on it. Now, I know the sun is really bright at the moment, and I'm hoping, is that showing up reasonably well, the texture? Okay. So working with this has just eroded a large amount of the marrow in the middle of the spur. So we're going to glue in an insert, but before we do that, we need to carve all of this down flat. So we have this little chisel. It's part of the bone carving tool kit that we made on the channel a year ago, and it's going to do a nice job of flattening out the bottom of that marrow section. Okay? I'm not going to do all of that right now. You get the idea. We're just going to carve it out nice and flat and get it all good and clean. Then that will be ready for that sort of repair. Now this piece, I just want to get some of these tails pulled out. Okay. This piece, the leather here stretched massively. Okay. That's part of the problem I've been having with it is, you can see it's just stretching. Okay, so this leather was too soft. Because it's stretched, the back of the handpiece is way too loose. So we are going to cut these ties. Now, I'm going to overlap these and pull that tight. And beloved, could you mark with the pen right along the back there? Yeah. Cool. Thank you. Okay. And now I'm just going to super glue that in place right there. Then we will be able to finish disassembling this, and it will become a pattern for our new and improved hand pump. I just wanted to give a little update and show a trick for this. Now, fitting, you can see how I've hollowed out all of that pith material from our antler time. And here's the little puck that we're fitting to be glued in there. Okay, this is almost done. Fitting bone to bone like this is difficult. It's slow and it's difficult because the bone has absolutely no give whatsoever, and it's a very slow process to sand or file it away. Okay, so you just go slow and take your time. But a trick for this is if you get your insert, okay, close, you can then take a pencil and mark up the inside surface. Okay, so there's some lead there, and then put it in, and then just give it a good, back and forth scrub in the cavity that you're creating. Okay, just like that. Mm-hmm. Okay, now, let me see. I'm not sure how well this is going to show up. I think it's showing up there reasonably well, but right there at the back,
it is.
You can see there's that little dark mark. Mm-hmm. So that shows you where it was hitting. And then we can come and scrape away everywhere there was pencil mark. And then do that iteratively. And you'll get a really good fit. So this is about there. The bottom, I'm starting to get a little bit thin on the bottom, and I'm starting to get a little bit close to that hole on the side. So if I don't get it so that it fits in perfectly, I'm okay with leaving it a little bit proud and then just filing off some of that surface. So I'm going to get this fit, I'm going to epoxy that in, and then we'll look at the next step after that. I trust that y'all can figure out how to mix some epoxy and glue the little puck in there once it is the right pucking shape. The puck has been inserted. You see, we just glued it in there in the end, did a little bit of cutting with the hacksaw, and then a little bit of flattening just with the scrapers. Okay, if you want to see how we made this and a few other scrapers, there's a video on making scrimshaw tools. I'll make sure that it's in the end screen. But for now, that's a nice, hard, solid insert that is not going to wear down the way the pith did. However, it's slippery. And in order to grab and hold the back of the sail needle when we're pushing with it, we need to put a bunch of divots in there. So that's just going to be a hand drill. I'm going to take a hand drill and just drill a pattern of 6 or 8 little depressions in there. Not deep holes. You don't want enough. You want it deep enough that when you're pressing, when you have your sail needle here, that the base of the needle will find the impression and you can really give it a good push. You don't want it to slide out and around. However, you don't want it so deep that it can grab and bend and twist the needle, or you can actually break a sail needle in canvas. I have proven that. So we're just going to take a hand drill, take some regular old, kind of round-ended drill bits, make a few depressions, and then this will be ready, and we will look at working with this. We have finished this little antler modification. So if I tilt this just so, you should be able to see the little holes in it. And those are just drilled in with a hand drill. So that's going to provide a nice place so that when we're holding our needle, it can seat into those holes, okay, and then push without sliding out. So that little bit is finished. We can set this aside for now. Now we need to look at this hand piece. Okay, so the core problem with this was that it was too thin and stretchy, and I don't know if you're going to really pick it up well, but I can even just pull it with my finger and stretch it after it having been perforated a couple of times while I was fishing around trying to find the best position for the antler. Also, if you look here, the antler had been in this position. Because the leather stretched and it worked, the antler was working and rubbing against the stitches and kind of wore through a couple there. Okay, so we need to think about that in the next design. And we had to take out the slack from that initial stretching. Okay, so we took out the slack just by unstitching that and gluing it. Now it's time to pull this all the way apart because it gets to be a pattern. When we made our first prototype, we didn't have a pattern, but now we do. So this is going to go a lot easier. Take those stitches out. I'm going to pull the little fuzzies so they're not in my way. Okay. So now that will lay flat. We'll do the same here. Where I am going to modify this is I don't like the wiggle in here with that being, kind of a flush edge joint. So when I cut this out again, I'm going to measure and put about an extra 3/4 inch of material so I can overlap and really stitch that in solid. Okay. So that will be a change. But again, we now have a pattern that we can lay out flat and cut. So we're going to do a 3-layer construction with this piece. I'm going to have a layer of thin leather, then we're going to have a lump which will raise the antler tine up above that a little bit so that it's not rubbing against stitching like there. Okay. There will also be less stitching because we'll make this out of one piece. And then another layer of the thin leather on top of all that. Okay. So what I'm going to use is the hardest thin leather that I have. And that's some of this pigskin that we hemlock bark tanned. Now some of this came out really, really nice. Some of this, even though this was soaking in tan bark for literally 2 years, there were some spots where it had a core that it absorbed enough of the tannin to preserve it, but not enough to fully soften it. Okay, so it's something kind of halfway in between a rawhide and a leather in a couple spots. This is one of those crunchy spots that I've tried a couple times to soften and it just hasn't. But for this, that's perfect. Absolutely perfect. So we're going to trace out our piece. We'll just find a good, good place for it there. We'll trace this out on here for the main wraparound, for the main handpiece. Okay, that'll be very, very stiff and it has basically no stretch whatsoever. Then we're going to cut out a little oval from this really thick cowhide. Okay, so we'll have that little oval, and then we will cut a larger oval from this again that will set down over and around and get wet formed to the cowhide. So I'm going to cut out these pieces based on this pattern, and then we'll be back and look at the next steps of how it's going to be wet formed before putting this thing together. We've got all our pieces parts around. Now this is going to be the little stump that we're going to be sewing our antler tine to. Okay. And if you can see here, I have just kind of eased the edge a little bit just by whittling with a knife. Okay, so that's rounded over just a smidgen, but I want dead flat the portion that's going to be underneath the tine. Now, I'm using an oval because that's the outline of my piece. If you were doing a slightly more traditional one and your hard palm was going to be like a pounded coin or a pounded piece of copper or a medallion of bone, you would want to make this piece of leather to whatever shape your actual bit is. Okay, so you're going to want to trace whatever your actual hard palm is and then leave a little bit extra so that you can round the edge. Okay, but that's going to be very case specific. We have our leather covering that's going to go on top of this, and as you can see, I have cut this out so that there's plenty of extra room to play with. Okay, because this is going to be the sandwich we're going to make is going to be a little bit tricky to line up perfectly. So if I slide off, I want, I just left basically a 1/2 inch seam allowance as you would do when sewing. Right, I traced this piece exactly and then left an extra 1/2 inch, just like with a seam allowance. Although in this case, it's not so much a seam allowance as it is a shimmy allowance. So if it shimmies, I want to allow for that. And then we have our piece of wood. Now, this is going to go insert leather covering this over and clamp. Okay? So even though this is functionally a single use jig, we're not going to really ever have the opportunity to use this for a second project, because if I do a second project, it's going to have a different hard palm with a different shape. Right? However, even though that's true, the bottom, because this is going to be pressed over wet leather with force, whatever we have on the bottom here is going to leave an imprint in that leather. Okay? So this has to be sanded smooth. After I traced my little bit of leather, okay, after I traced that, I just drilled it out with a spade bit, and that gave a couple of tear out spots. And those tear out spots, I took and I filled them with a little bit of epoxy that had some sawdust mixed in. Okay, and then sanded it down. Even though it's single use, that still has to be done well, because any big creases, any big divots, you can see right there, that was a here and here, these three in particular were pretty large tear out sections. Okay, so we don't want that making a permanent impression in our leather. So even though it's single use, it still has to be done smooth and well. So now what we're going to do is this piece of leather I have soaked overnight. So it is fully, completely saturated and as supple as it's ever going to be. Okay? It's going to dry fairly hard because I'm not going to be working it, but it's as supple as it's ever going to be. Before I put it in the water, I traced around this so that I can see where that piece is going to go. It's black Sharpie against very, very dark brown background, so the tracing probably won't show up in the camera, but I can see it well enough to position this accurately. Okay. Then I'm going to transfer that big end forward, okay, to here, and I can just kind of push it down in and feel with my hands that it's going to the right location. Put a backer plate on, and this can be any scrap, and then I'm going to clamp it. Okay, just to hold it. Now, this is single use. We need a smooth side, I've already said that, but it can be any old scrap you want to use. All that we need is to make sure that the top plate is thick enough that these two pieces of leather won't come all the way through and be flush to the top. Because while I'm showing this with just kind of a craft clamp here, and you could just put 3 or 4 craft clamps, I'm going to take this to the biggest vise that I have on the property and clamp it in the vise to dry. Okay? And that will just give me much better, more consistent pressure. Okay? But you could do 4 craft clamps around here. But since I got to put it in a vise, I don't want that surface to come through and get a vise imprint. So now that this is positioned and clamped, I'm going to take it to a vise, and then it's just going to dry for 24 hours, and then we will come back and look at the fully wet form piece. I unclamped this. It was clamped up for very close to 24 hours, although I didn't exactly measure it. So good long time. You want to make sure when you're wet forming leather that you give it ample time to dry. Okay. It is shrinking. As it dries, it's going to want to kind of shrink up a little bit. So if you clamp it and have it in its mold for 3/4 of the way, it will feel dry, but will still have some moisture. And then as that moisture leaves, it will shrink and distort and can cause problems. Now, that is reversible by re-wetting it and reclamping it. It's not like you have to throw the piece of leather away if that happens. but you just lost a day of your project, right? And in these things that have so much hurry up and wait, that's not what we're going for. Okay, so here's our piece. You can see this fits in nice and perfectly flat. Came out really, really well. The mark for the tip of it is right there, so it did slide back a little bit, and then there, which is why we left some extra room, right? Anticipating that it would slide around a little bit. You don't want to do a molding project like this with 0 tolerances. Right? You always want to give yourself a little extra tolerance for things to move. The more experience you get and the more you do it, the less tolerance you have to leave, and I left myself quite a bit more than I needed here, but you always want to leave some extra tolerance. The next 2 things that we're going to need to do is we're going to need to attach our little filler lump in here, and we're going to need to sew our hard palm onto the lump. Okay, so to make holes in this much leather, especially with this really, really hard pigskin, I'm going to need to do that with a drill. To do that with a drill and keep everything lined up, I'm going to need to glue in the lump. Okay, so we're going to mark the holes just by positioning our hard palm, taking a needle and just wiggling it around and spinning and making a divot that we can see, a little prick, and then we can just put a little Sharpie spot on top of that little prick. Okay, then we will drill those holes out. But before drilling out these holes, I want to glue this in place. And I'm going to use a good flexible shoe glue of whatever brand you like. I will often tack things when I'm doing leather work with rubber cement, just because it's really quick and I don't really care that much if the glue comes loose over time. But in this instance, I really want this glued in well. So I'm going to apply a little bit to both surfaces. And then just take a smearing stick smear it around a little bit, get it nice and even. This doesn't have to be perfect because we are going to stitch through this, but to prevent drumming, I want good adhesion, especially here in the middle.
What does drumming mean?
Drumming is when you're gluing 2 things like this and you have an air gap in between here and there, and then it pokes out. Think like the lid on the pop lid on a canning jar. Mm-hmm. You know how it goes pop, 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 pop? Right, that's drumming. Okay. And when we're gluing 2 things like this, we don't want that. It's a defect. Okay. So, to prevent that, we'll make sure that we have a good coat, especially there on the flat. Just kind of wiggle it, smear it around a little bit. But again, this is going to be sewn in place. This is not the only way that we're going to attach it. Now, I'm going to clamp it back in. Just tear a scrap of my pattern making paper. Set that underneath there. Set that on top. And then the clamps go back on. We don't need as much force this time. We're not trying to deform the material. Just trying to make sure that it stays flat as it dries. Okay, so I will let that dry and harden. That will hold everything in place while I position this, mark the holes, drill them out, and then we'll talk about stitching together. I hope that you're enjoying this content, and if you are, I would love to invite you to join our Patreon page and the community over there. The Patreon and that funding is super important for this channel as well as most YouTube channels. The it just takes resources to do these things, to buy materials, to go on trips, to go interview people, to do activities, and we're trying to build and make the channel better in all of those categories. So we're super grateful for everybody who's already there. And if you would like to come and join the ranks of those folks, we have a lot of rewards for the folks who do join on the Patreon. We have a large repository of historic information on traditional skills that have been re-indexed and edited and produced in easy-to-print formats and formats that are easy to put into a page reader. And it's indexed by skill rather than all of the random ways that it was indexed in the past. So you can access what you want. We also have a lot of plans and patterns for various projects, like this shoulder bag that we're going to replicate here soon. The fur stretchers behind me are another example. And all of that library becomes an infinite access resource to you when you join the Patron at any of the paid tiers, even at $1 a month. If you don't want to join that way, they can be purchased as individual downloads as well. And we're just so grateful for everybody who's there and wanted to invite you. Now that we've explained the Patreon, I wanted to mention specifically that I am putting this tracing pattern up on Patreon. So if you're interested in this, if you want to make one of these palm thimbles, but you don't know where to, get started, and don't want to just make it from complete scratch, you can have this pattern available to you. You will need to adjust the length to go around your thumb. Okay, but I will mark where my thumb juncture is and then extend this out. And then the same here, you'll need to adjust this length for your actual hand circumference. But that will give you a very good place to start if you want to start working on it, and then cut a mold that goes around whatever item you use for the heart palm. Let's get back to the process in the video. Now, the next thing that we need to do is prepare our sinew thread. We've glued that, we've marked it, we've drilled it out, we're ready to put our piece on. But the best thread to sew this up is sinew. Sinew is better than anything else that we could ever use because it shrinks. So we're going to soak it in some hide glue. Knox gelatin is just hide glue. And that will reattach all of the sinew fibers to each other and allow it to be just looped together without any needing for knots, because it will just fuse into one piece when it dries. And then as it dries, it will shrink and it will suck everything together so tightly it's unbelievable. Okay, so it's just marvelous, marvelous stuff. Now, I've already prepared a bunch here, but just to show you the steps, I've done videos on sinew prep before. The first thing you want to do is pound it. Now, I'm going to quick turn the sound off. Okay, I just didn't want to bust your ears there, so you pound it, and then as you pound it, it comes loose, and it will pull off into these nice threads. Okay, different lengths, different pieces. I've got all sorts of stuff. I know this stuff is cow sinew. I like, the larger the animal you get, the better. So I like to target cow. I have some deer from, my own butchering. If you're in an area where you can get elk or moose, that's really, really good. But backstrap sinew is the silver skin across the top of the tenderloins. That's the best of the best. Leg sinew also works perfectly nicely, but it's a little bit shorter and fuzzier, but it all works well. The bigger the stick and the bigger the animal, the better off in the long run you are. Okay? So we take our sinew threads. Now, to make it nice and soft and supple, we want to dip it in some hide glue. Hide glue is just cooked down collagen till it's fallen apart into its monomers. And sinew is just pure collagen, and leather is tanned pure collagen, right? So everything here is compatible with everything else. The purest, easiest to find form of hide glue in most of the modern world is unflavored gelatin. Right? It's just food grade hide glue, literally. So what we have here is my standard mix for making this for crafting purposes. is 1 pack or 1 tablespoon of unflavored gelatin, depending on whether you're getting it in packs or in like a bulk form. A little sprinkle of borax, which is optional. The borax, its purpose, it doesn't do anything in terms of hardening the glue or preventing it from hardening or modifying it in any way. It makes it so bugs don't want to eat it. Right? And one of the downsides to using natural sinew is beetles like to chew on it. So it just beetle proofs the sinew when we're done. But it's optional. I've heard comments. I use borax in a lot of things, and I've had some folks comment on, channel posts that they can't get it in their area for one reason or another. So if you can't get it, don't worry about it. If you can get it, it does help bug-proof things. Okay? So we're just going to sew as normal, but we're not going to need to tie any knots because this stuff is really good at sticking to itself. We're just going to pull that through, hold the tag, take our antler tine, same deal. Okay. These first couple of stitches, it can sometimes be tricky to get everything lined up. And I have pliers here because this stuff is slippery. Okay. So I'm just going to hold that tail down, give that a pull. Need to be able to see my holes. Okay, now on this stitch, what we're going to do is we're going to take this tail and we're just going to kind of wrap it a full time around on the inside of this stitch. Okay, so it's laced in there. This is slimy, slimy stuff. Now, one of the nice things about it, well, one of the not so nice things about it, is it gets very hard to pull this needle around. There we are. So I have pliers handy for that. That kind of came a little loose. Give it a little tug. Yep. Fingers are slipping on it, so pliers. Give her a tug. Now, once we get all the way to the end, we're just going to double back. I just call this the Mountain Man saddle stitch. Ooh!
Well,
Broke a needle. Now that first side, that piece was just so thick, it put me on the struggle bus a little bit. I broke 2 needles of the sail needles, went to a third needle that passed through better. This is just straighter darning needle. But it was just tearing through the sinew because it was just too, there wasn't enough clearance. Okay, so this side I used a thinner piece, and it worked quite well. Now, the amount of material going through these holes on each side is about the same. The only thing that's annoying me a little bit is on the first side, I had to tie it on the outside, which is bulky and not where I wanted, because I could not get it to go back down through. But this one, I did the stitch back, forward, turned over, came down 1 extra so that it's on the bottom. And now the normal way to finish this off is just to pass under one of the stitches And then just do that a couple of times. Just kind of doing a twist under there. And then we'll trim that off. And when this hide glue hardens, I'll show you this tomorrow morning. When this hide glue hardens, that's going to just be as solid as can be, and it's going to shrink up incredibly. Just going to kind of tuck the loose end there so it doesn't have any unravelly business. Okay. And you will see just how tight and just how different this looks when that dries and hardens. This is all dried down, and it is just rock solid. If I grab it nose and tail and really try to wiggle it, I can get the tiniest bit of wiggle. But if I'm just moving it forward and back in the direction that's actually going to move in life, there's nothing, right? It's solid. So we now need to look at cutting this out so we can start thinking about assembling things, okay? And when I put this in the mold and dried it after the wet forming, it slid a little bit back, okay, but it really sat just about exactly where I wanted it side to side. So I think we're pretty good in terms of making these initial cuts across here and across here. We should be pretty much okay side to side, but I'm going to be a little bit careful there. And I'm just going to start cutting a little bit and then seeing how it fits on our hand strap, okay? And get this cut out, trimmed down to size so that we're ready to go forward. That is all trimmed down. I cut it a little bit closer to the antler tine than the line originally was, but again, it slid in this direction, so that's expected. That means our layout was basically correct. Okay, we have plenty of room around here to get a good line of stitching in, and that's going to fit in right there like that. I left this back end a little bit long, and that tail is going to kind of curl around the hand and just add a little extra rigidity there. Okay, so good stuff. Now we're just going to start to do the final assembly. So this piece, where it wraps around the thumb, this is right where I want it, and that little corner I want that little corner right at that little corner. So just going to kind of prep this. Put one little drop of super glue there. Tiny, tiny little touch. Set that down. Hold it with my thumb. Now between that tiny speck of super glue and this little clamp on that tail end, that will be plenty to align it. I'm going to do a horseshoe of stitches across and around. Okay. Trim that tail off, and then we will start sewing the business end in. There's our little stitch on that thumb ring coming around. Now that doesn't have to be anything fancy. That's going to be almost entirely hidden. What I did do is when I finished this off, I ended at this stitch, looped it under that stitch once, looped it under that stitch once, and then came through at an angle. So this tag end ended up tucked under that little flap and on top, because that way I don't have a tag end in the bottom. And if you look how this is going to seat, that's all going to be completely and totally hidden. Right? So all of that stitching is invisible. This is going to get stuck on just like so. We'll put some clips on it here at the bottom. My clips will come apart to hold it in place. Then we're just going to punch holes with the awl and stitch as normal. The only thing different being that we're continuing to use the natural sinew for this project. It's a really good, solid, stiffening, shrink in, lock everything together material to work with. Here we are. This is down to the home stretch. So the next thing we need to do, all this stitching is on and it's dry enough that it's all going to hold, right? That will still shrink a little tighter and get a little harder and stiffer overnight, but it's dry enough that it's locked into place and none of this is going to work as I mess with it. So the next and almost last thing we need to do is to bring the back of the hand loop, right? So this is going to go around here, okay, and stitch that in. Now, right there, along there is the line from when I measured off of the one that I cut apart. And in the original one, I had made that as a butt joint. In this one, I'm going to do an overlap. So I took and I skived this down a little bit just with this chip carving knife. We're going to need to fold and kind of crease this a little bit. It doesn't need to be perfect now. We will do a little bit more with that later. Bring this in, and we're going to stitch that in place just like so. So this is going to be really fiddly, but also, quite straightforward. I want that line to line up right like that. Okay, the back of it is just going to be inside. Well, we have a piece. It is fastened all the way around. Okay, this was that last seam that we just did across the back of the thumb holder. Now, it works, but it's just a little bit awkward, okay, because this bit, here, point it that way, this bit doesn't want to form quite right across the back of my hand, okay, because it's very, very stiff. We have two layers, and this top layer, I use the absolute stiffest piece of leather that I could find. So what we need to do next is take it, and I need to let these stitches dry all the way before I do this, right? Because if I wet them now, stuff could get slippery and slide away because they're still quite damp. We got to let that dry for a couple hours. And then I'm going to wet this back, okay, just a little bit, and mold it wet. Okay, right? You see how it's kind of pulling against the thumb here, and that wants to pull this too far forward and up, right? So when I wet this, I can then push it forward, let it dry in that position, and it will hold it when it dries. Okay? So that's what we're going to do yet on this is let that dry, get that wet, and then just fold it and mold it and hold it, and I will leave it on my hand for part of that drying process so that it dries and conforms to my hand. So here we go. This is the final product molded to my hand by wetting it and then just wearing it for a couple hours. Okay. Now, this is going to mold it. It's also going to show you if there's any hot spots or any problems. Okay, so along this edge, I took a scissors and trimmed that a little bit because when I was putting it on and off, it was rubbing really hard on my hand. Yeah, right about there. It was rubbing really hard on my hand. And the same thing right here where that goes over the thumb webbing. Okay, I trimmed a little bit out of that region. So you just got a pattern is a loose approximation of something that can basically fit to the human body. It's not all there is. It's not the whole finished thing. You've got to go do it, make it, and then, finalize it according to what works for you. So wetting this and then forming it, we also, made a nice edge here that's stable and isn't just wiggling all over the place. Nice little fold in there and then let that dry. And if I put it on, you can see it is a tight fit on. And it should be a tight fit on. Firstly, this is the hardest, toughest piece of leather that I have access to at the moment. But even with hard, tough veg tan leather, they still stretch some. So it should be a little bit undersized with the assumption that it will stretch a little bit in use. Okay, so that's about perfect, and it's very stable on my hand as I'm wearing it. This pad is very well designed. Very, very nice height and everything. And I've used it a little bit stitching on a different project, and the position is right front to back, okay, but the pad lifted it up enough, it's just enough different from what it was before that I'm having to relearn the muscle memory, okay, and any project, there's always a next iteration, okay, I like the position of this better than in the first one. I like the stability much better than in the first one. However, if I hold the needle, you can see when I bring it in, it's a little bit more of a glancing blow. Okay. Now, it still holds because of the divots I drilled into it. But I'm going to use it for a while, and I might end up reshaping that insert. But that insert goes back down to here, so I have plenty of material to mess with. Okay? So there's a good chance I'm going to end up carving down this side where the needle's hitting. Okay? So that when I'm coming in, it's more of a direct push. If I take just an 1/8 inch out of here and then re-drill the divots, the needle will have a lot more purchase. Okay? But with the geometry, that is where it needs to be. The face of this is correctly located. I just might need to change the geometry of it a little bit. But that's the nice thing about working with a really solid material. And when I was excavating the pith out, I went down to about here and was pretty much running out of pith. Okay, so we have solid bone glued into that whole cavity with that big thick puck that we put in. So I don't need to worry about excavating past the hard material and ending up with something that won't hold up. So that's just a function of playing with it, and I really like how the natural sinew pulled everything together and made a really stable construction. So I hope that you learned something from this and saw some construction techniques, and even if you're not going to make one of these in particular, see how different things go together, work together, what materials work well with what other materials. You can make better stuff than you can buy, right? Most of the time, unless you're buying through other bespoke craftspeople, which I also encourage, you can make better stuff. So I hope you got something from this, and we'll go make some tools, do some leather work, experiment with different new materials, and learn from your iterations and keep iterating. That's how you really make progress in your craft. But either way, I hope that you'll join us back here next time at Old Ways Rising Farm, and have a blessed day.